Some places don't call you with sound, they call you with silence. The words lingered in the back of Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker's mind as the rain pressed down over the empty outskirts of Millhaven, a forgotten industrial town just off Interstate 84 where the streetlights flickered like they were struggling to remember their own purpose. Ethan stood near the edge of a cracked service road, the hood of his dark field jacket pulled low, boots planted in wet gravel that shifted under every slow breath of wind. At 34, he carried the quiet weight of someone who had learned to read danger not through noise, but through absence of it. That morning had started like any other routine inspection assignment. Nothing unusual on the reports, nothing flagged on the grid, yet something in the air felt misaligned, as if the world had tilted a fraction of a degree and refused to settle back into place. That was when he saw it, emerging from the gray curtain of rain like a thought that didn't belong to reality. A German shepherd, soaked, lean, and still in a way that didn't match any stray animal behavior he had ever been trained to recognize. The dog didn't bark, didn't circle, didn't hesitate. It simply stood at a distance of roughly 20 yards, head slightly lowered, amber eyes locked directly onto Ethan as though measuring him, not for threat, but for understanding. Ethan's hand instinctively rested near his belt, not drawing, not threatening, just acknowledging old habits that never fully left a man who had once served overseas in environments where every movement had meaning. Easy, he murmured under his breath, though the word wasn't really for the dog, it was for himself. The German shepherd took one step forward, slow and deliberate, then stopped again, as if confirming that Ethan was still following the invisible thread only it could see. Rainwater streamed down its coat, darkening the sable pattern along its back, and yet there was something unmistakably controlled about its posture, something trained, disciplined, almost military in its restraint. Ethan frowned slightly, his eyes narrowing as recognition flickered somewhere beneath memory, because stray dogs didn't move like that, didn't pause like that, didn't observe like that. The wind shifted, carrying the distant hum of an abandoned highway overpass about half a mile away, and for a brief moment the dog turned its head in that direction, ears tightening, as if responding to something beyond human perception. Then, without warning, it began to walk, not run, not flee, but walk, stopping every few seconds to ensure Ethan was still behind it. Ethan hesitated only a moment before stepping forward, gravel crunching beneath his boots, the decision less about curiosity and more about instinct he didn't fully trust but couldn't ignore. As they moved deeper along the forgotten service road, the landscape began to change subtly. Warehouses with rusted fences, collapsed signage from businesses long gone, and utility poles leaning at angles that suggested years of neglect. The dog never strayed from its path, guiding him with a certainty that felt almost intentional, and with each step Ethan felt the familiar pressure of something unresolved pressing at the edges of his thoughts, something he couldn't yet name. About 15 minutes into the walk, the silhouette of a large structure emerged through the mist, its outline jagged against the overcast sky, windows dark and uneven like hollow eyes watching from another time. Ethan slowed instinctively, recognizing it as the old Millhaven Regional Hospital, a facility decommissioned nearly a decade ago after funding cuts and structural damage reports, officially marked as condemned and inaccessible. Yet the German shepherd did not stop. It stood at the rusted perimeter gate, now partially broken and hanging open at an angle that suggested recent disturbance, and turned its head back toward Ethan one final time, as if asking a question without words. Ethan approached slowly, scanning the perimeter, noting details his training never let him ignore: fresh footprints in the mud, a faintly disturbed chain link, and the subtle glow of something metallic reflecting faint light from within the building. The air here was different, heavier, like it had been sealed away and forgotten by time itself. "You've been here before," Ethan said quietly, not expecting an answer, but the dog only stepped forward into the gap in the fence, disappearing into the shadowed entrance without hesitation. Ethan exhaled slowly, adjusting his grip on the small flashlight clipped to his vest, and followed. Inside, the hospital swallowed sound almost completely, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty but held, as if the building itself was listening. Dust floated through narrow beams of weak light filtering from cracked ceiling panels above, drifting like slow snowfall through corridors lined with peeling paint and abandoned equipment carts. The German Shepherd moved ahead without hesitation, pausing only at intersections, as if remembering a map only it could see, and each time it waited just long enough for Ethan to catch up before continuing forward. Somewhere deeper inside the structure, a faint mechanical hum pulsed irregularly, not strong enough to be clearly identified, but present enough to suggest the building was not entirely as abandoned as official records claimed. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes before understanding something has already begun long before you arrived. The dog stopped suddenly at the entrance of a long hallway, its posture shifting, ears angled forward, body rigid in a way that signaled alertness rather than aggression. Ethan raised his light slowly, illuminating rows of closed doors stretching into darkness, each one identical, each one sealed in silence. And for the first time he realized the dog hadn't brought him here by accident. It had brought him here because something inside this place still remembered how to wait. The moment Ethan crossed the threshold of the abandoned hospital, the world outside seemed to disappear behind him, as if the building itself had sealed the entrance shut with silence rather than doors. The air inside was colder, not in temperature alone, but in presence, carrying the stagnant weight of years without human breath, and every step forward made the floor beneath him respond with a faint, hollow echo that traveled too far too fast. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness in a narrow, trembling line, revealing peeling paint along the corridor walls, faded warning signs in medical English that had long lost their urgency, and scattered debris that looked like it had been left in a hurry rather than abandoned with peace. The German Shepherd moved ahead without hesitation, paws pressing softly against the linoleum floor, stopping only at intersections where it would pause, look back at Ethan, and then choose a direction with quiet certainty that felt almost like memory rather than instinct. Ethan followed in silence, his senses narrowing, his training resurfacing in fragments as his eyes tracked every reflection, every shadow shift, every unnatural detail that did not belong in a building supposedly emptied for nearly a decade. Somewhere deeper inside, that faint mechanical hum grew slightly clearer, pulsing at irregular intervals like a heartbeat that refused to match any living rhythm. He slowed near a partially open door marked emergency observation, pushing it gently with the edge of his light, revealing a room filled with overturned chairs, rusted medical equipment, and papers scattered across the floor like abandoned thoughts. The dog stopped at the doorway but did not enter, instead focusing its gaze on the far side of the room where a set of cabinets stood slightly ajar, one of them emitting a faint metallic glint whenever the light shifted. Ethan stepped inside cautiously, scanning the space, his boots crunching softly against broken glass fragments that reflected tiny shards of light like fractured memories. On the wall near the cabinets, he noticed something that made him pause longer than he intended, a faded inspection chart still pinned in place, dated nearly 10 years ago, with signatures that had been deliberately crossed out rather than erased. The German Shepherd let out a low, controlled sound, not a bark, not a whimper, but something closer to a signal, and Ethan felt his attention snap back toward the cabinet. He moved closer, flashlight steady now, and noticed that the metal door was not fully closed. It had been sealed with a lock that had since been removed, leaving behind scratches that suggested repeated attempts to open it over time. Inside, partially visible through the gap, were folders, some yellowed with age, others strangely newer than they should have been, stacked in an order that suggested someone had been maintaining them recently. Ethan reached for the handle slowly, then paused as the German Shepherd stepped forward and placed itself between him and the cabinet, not aggressively, but firmly, as if enforcing a boundary it had been trained to respect. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, studying the dog's expression, noticing how its eyes were fixed not on him, but on what lay behind the cabinet door, as though warning him that what he was about to see was not simply information but consequence. He lowered his hand slightly, shifting his focus instead to the surrounding room, and that was when he noticed the subtle pattern of footprints on the dusty floor, overlapping trails that suggested multiple entries in recent weeks rather than a single long-forgotten evacuation. The realization settled in slowly, uncomfortable and precise, that this place had not been entirely abandoned, It had been maintained in fragments, as if someone had been returning here in intervals too controlled to be random. The dog moved again, leading Ethan deeper into the hospital, through a narrow hallway where ceiling tiles had collapsed in sections, revealing tangled wiring that still carried a faint intermittent glow, and past doors labeled in fading ink that referenced departments long decommissioned. As they approached a stairwell leading downward, the mechanical hum grew slightly louder, now accompanied by a faint vibration that Ethan could feel through the soles of his boots, subtle but deliberate, like machinery operating beneath the structure. The German Shepherd stopped at the top of the stairs, staring downward into darkness that swallowed the light completely beyond a few feet, then turned its head back toward Ethan with a stillness that felt heavier than warning. Ethan adjusted his grip on the flashlight, his breathing steady but measured, and looked down into the stairwell where the air seemed colder, denser, as if the building itself was exhaling from below. For a long moment, neither of them moved, suspended between what was known and what was still waiting to be uncovered. And then the dog took the first step downward, disappearing into the darkness while Ethan followed behind, each step carrying him further away from anything that could still be called routine. The stairwell swallowed every trace of light the moment Ethan stepped below the first landing, as if the building had decided that anything beneath this level no longer deserved to be seen. The air shifted again, becoming heavier and noticeably stiller, carrying a faint metallic undertone that clung to the back of his throat with every breath. His flashlight angled downward, revealing chipped concrete steps worn by time and pressure, each one marked with faint scuffs that suggested recent passage despite official records stating this section had been sealed for years. The German Shepherd moved ahead of him without hesitation, placing its paws carefully on each step, pausing briefly at every landing, as if confirming an invisible map only it could interpret. Ethan kept a steady distance behind, his left hand brushing the cold railing while his eyes tracked the environment with increasing focus, noticing details that no longer fit the narrative of abandonment. The walls here were not as decayed as above, cleaner in sections, as though someone had recently wiped away dust in selective patterns that made no logical sense in a forgotten facility. About halfway down, the faint mechanical hum that had been present earlier became more defined, now joined by a subtle rhythmic pulse that seemed to rise from deeper within the structure rather than from any visible machinery. Ethan slowed, adjusting his stance, his instincts shifting from observation to evaluation, as the sound resembled an organized system rather than a failing one. The German Shepherd stopped at the bottom of the stairwell and looked down a long corridor stretching into darkness, its posture tense but controlled, ears angled forward, body perfectly still. Ethan reached the final step and paused beside it, raising his flashlight to reveal a hallway lined with closed doors, each marked with faded numeric codes and outdated medical labels that had long since been removed from modern hospital systems. Yet something about the arrangement felt intentional, not random, as if the corridor had been preserved rather than abandoned. He moved forward slowly, the dog leading once again, their footsteps echoing in a synchronized rhythm that felt increasingly out of place in a structure meant to be empty. As they advanced, Ethan began to notice subtle signs of recent human interaction that contradicted everything he had been told about the facility, including faint electrical wiring extensions running along the base of the walls and sections of ceiling panels that had been replaced with newer materials that did not match the original construction. The air carried a faint sterile undertone now, almost imperceptible but distinct enough to suggest recent medical presence, a detail that tightened Ethan's focus further as he cataloged every inconsistency. The German Shepherd suddenly stopped at a door halfway down the corridor, different from the others, reinforced with heavier metal framing and fitted with a manual locking mechanism that appeared significantly newer than the surrounding structure. The dog placed its nose near the seam of the door and let out a low, steady sound that seemed less like a warning and more like recognition, as if it had arrived at a destination it already knew. Ethan stepped closer, shining his flashlight along the edges, noting fresh scratches near the lock and faint residue on the handle that suggested repeated handling within a relatively recent time frame. He hesitated, feeling the weight of something unspoken pressing against the moment, as if the building itself was waiting for him to decide whether to proceed or turn back. The mechanical hum beyond the door grew slightly louder, now clearly emanating from within, steady and controlled, not random, not broken, but operational in a way that contradicted every assumption about abandonment. Ethan exhaled slowly, shifting his grip on the flashlight, and looked at the German shepherd, whose eyes remained fixed on the door with unwavering focus, as if confirming that this was the point of no return. He raised his hand toward the handle, then paused again as a faint sound reached them from the other side, subtle and rhythmic, like equipment operating under supervision. The corridor behind them remained silent, but the space ahead felt increasingly defined, no longer empty, no longer forgotten, but waiting with deliberate intention. Ethan lowered his hand slightly, recalibrating his thoughts as years of training surfaced in fragmented clarity, warning him that what lay beyond this door was not simply a room, but a system that had continued functioning long after it was meant to have ended. The German shepherd stepped back just enough to give him space, yet did not look away, maintaining its focus on the threshold as if acknowledging that whatever truth existed here would now be shared. Ethan finally placed his hand on the handle, and for a brief moment the entire corridor seemed to hold its breath. The moment Ethan Walker pressed the handle, the entire corridor seemed to compress into silence, so complete it felt physical, as if the air itself had hardened around his decision. For a fraction of a second nothing happened, only the faint vibration from beyond the door continuing its steady, controlled rhythm. Then the mechanism gave way with a soft mechanical click that sounded far too precise for something inside an abandoned hospital. The German shepherd did not move forward immediately, instead holding its position just behind Ethan's left side, its body aligned with his, as if entering together was part of an unspoken protocol. Ethan pushed the door inward slowly, the hinges resisting at first before yielding with a quiet protest, revealing a room illuminated by low, artificial lighting that contrasted sharply with the darkness of the corridor. Inside, the space was not what he had expected. It was not a decayed storage room or a collapsed medical ward, but a partially restored operational chamber lined with equipment that still carried faint power indicators glowing in muted green and amber tones. Rows of monitors were mounted along one wall, some dark, others flickering with unstable signals that suggested a system still in use despite its supposed decommission. Ethan stepped inside cautiously, his flashlight lowering slightly as his eyes adjusted to the controlled lighting that revealed a level of maintenance completely inconsistent with the building's official status. The German shepherd moved ahead slowly now, its earlier tension replaced with a focused calm, approaching the center of the room where a circular console stood surrounded by cables and data panels. The mechanical hum was now unmistakably coming from this system, steady and deliberate, like a machine operating on a schedule rather than survival. Ethan scanned the surroundings, noting that the floor was cleaner here, almost sterile in sections, with markings on the ground that resembled movement pathways rather than random wear. On a nearby table lay several sealed folders arranged in a deliberate sequence, each labeled with codes rather than names, suggesting classification beyond civilian medical records. He approached them carefully, picking one up and opening it just enough to see structured documentation inside, though the content was partially obscured by redacted lines and stamped markings indicating restricted status. The German shepherd suddenly lifted its head, staring toward the far side of the room, where another door stood partially open, revealing a dimly lit adjoining space with faint blinking lights. Ethan turned his attention in that direction, feeling the weight of something unresolved tightening in his chest as the realization began to form that this room was not isolated, but part of a larger hidden system beneath the hospital. He moved closer to the adjacent doorway, flashlight cutting through the low light, revealing additional equipment racks and what appeared to be server units still running at minimal capacity. The air here carried a faint electrical warmth, contrasting with the cold decay of the upper levels, reinforcing the sense that this place had been sustained deliberately. Ethan paused near the threshold, listening, and beneath the mechanical hum he detected a softer, irregular rhythm, almost like distant footsteps or shifting movement occurring somewhere deeper within the structure. The German shepherd stepped forward first, entering the next room without hesitation, and Ethan followed, each step measured and deliberate as his training urged him to remain aware of both environment and anomaly. Inside the second chamber, the scale of the operation became clearer, with interconnected systems spanning multiple stations, each one displaying data streams that continued to update in real time. Ethan recognized patterns consistent with surveillance and tracking infrastructure, though the origin and purpose were not immediately clear, and the presence of active systems in a condemned facility defied all official records he had reviewed. The German Shepherd stopped at the center of the room and focused on a specific console where a faint blinking indicator displayed a sequence of coordinates that repeated at regular intervals. Ethan approached slowly, leaning in to examine the display, and as he did, the coordinates shifted slightly, updating as if responding to movement within the building itself. A subtle realization formed in his mind, uncomfortable and precise, that whatever system existed here was not dormant, and it was not waiting to be discovered. It was actively aware of their presence. He looked down at the German Shepherd, whose gaze remained fixed on the console with unwavering certainty, as if confirming that this was the destination it had been leading him toward all along. The hum deepened slightly, and somewhere beneath the structure, another layer of machinery engaged with a soft but distinct activation tone that reverberated through the floor. Ethan straightened slowly, scanning the room once more, understanding now that what he had entered was not merely a forgotten hospital, but something still functioning beneath the surface of official reality, waiting quietly for the right moment to be fully revealed. The moment Ethan Walker stared at the shifting coordinates on the glowing console, the entire room felt less like a hidden facility and more like a living system that had been waiting for interaction. The soft mechanical hum that had followed them from the stairwell now synchronized with subtle pulses of light across multiple monitors, as if the building itself was responding in real time to their presence. Ethan took a slow step closer, eyes scanning the interface, noticing that the data streams were not random or degraded, but structured with precision that suggested active monitoring rather than archival storage. The German Shepherd stood beside him, perfectly still, its gaze locked on the same central display where the coordinates continued to update at fixed intervals, almost like a beacon locked onto a moving subject. Ethan's hand hovered near the console without touching it, his instincts warning him that whatever system this was, it was not meant to be casually interrupted. The air in the room felt warmer now, not from physical temperature, but from the sustained operation of machines that had clearly never fully shut down. He shifted his attention to the surrounding equipment racks, noticing subtle labeling patterns that repeated across devices, all marked with similar coded identifiers that did not match any public medical or civilian classification he recognized. The German Shepherd suddenly took a single step forward and tilted its head slightly, focusing on a lower section of the console where a secondary screen flickered to life without manual input. On it, a series of short entries began to scroll upward in a steady rhythm, each line appearing and disappearing with calculated timing that suggested automated surveillance logging. Ethan leaned in slightly, reading fragments of structured data that referenced movement tracking, environmental scans, and operational containment fields, though the terminology was partially obscured by system-level redactions. A faint vibration passed through the floor again, stronger than before, causing a slight tremor in the metal structures around them, and Ethan instinctively steadied himself while keeping his eyes on the displays. The German Shepherd did not react with fear, only with heightened awareness, its ears angled forward as if interpreting patterns beneath human comprehension. Ethan turned slowly in place, reassessing the room from a wider perspective, now noticing that the equipment layout formed a circular pattern centered around the main console, suggesting a designed observation hub rather than a standard medical station. He realized with growing clarity that the abandoned hospital narrative did not align with the infrastructure around him, and that this location had likely been repurposed or concealed for an entirely different function long after its official closure. The screens shifted again, and this time the coordinates stabilized, locking onto a fixed point deeper within the building, accompanied by a soft tone that echoed faintly through the room like a confirmation signal. Ethan felt a subtle tightening in his chest as he understood that whatever system existed here was not only active, but also directional, responding to proximity and possibly tracking something that was still moving. The German Shepherd moved closer to the console and placed its front paw near the base, not pressing anything but asserting presence, as if confirming recognition of the system's output. Ethan watched the screens carefully as a new layer of data appeared, revealing fragmented visual maps of the hospital structure, overlaid with moving markers that suggested real-time positional tracking within the building itself. His breathing remained controlled, but his focus sharpened as he began to trace the logic of the system, recognizing patterns that implied continuous monitoring across multiple zones, including areas they had not yet accessed. The hum deepened again, and a soft mechanical click echoed somewhere beyond the walls, followed by a distant shift in energy that made the lighting flicker briefly before stabilizing. Ethan exchanged a brief glance with the German Shepherd, and in that silent exchange there was no confusion, only alignment, as if both of them understood they were no longer simply exploring an abandoned structure, but standing inside an operational network that had just acknowledged their arrival. The moment the system confirmed their presence through shifting coordinates and synchronized pulses of light, Ethan Walker felt the entire environment settle into a new kind of awareness, as if the hidden infrastructure beneath the abandoned hospital had fully transitioned from passive operation to active observation. The German Shepherd remained beside him, its posture steady but alert, eyes fixed on the central console where the data streams had begun to reorganize into layered patterns that resembled structured maps rather than random telemetry. Ethan slowly shifted his attention across the room, noticing that every monitor now displayed similar movement indicators, each one updating in subtle increments that suggested continuous tracking across multiple zones within the facility. The air felt denser now, not heavier in a physical sense, but charged with the implication of systems operating beyond their expected limits, as if the building itself had developed a secondary function hidden beneath its original purpose. He took a careful step closer to one of the side terminals, observing how the interface responded instantly to proximity without any physical input, the screen brightening slightly as new lines of data appeared. The German Shepherd moved in parallel, circling the console with deliberate focus before stopping at a point where a secondary access panel had been partially concealed behind modular casing. Ethan noticed this immediately and lowered himself slightly to inspect it, recognizing that the panel was not part of standard hospital architecture, but rather an integrated component of a separate system installed afterward. As he examined the edges, a faint vibration traveled through the floor again, stronger than before, accompanied by a brief fluctuation in the lighting that caused the entire room to dim and then recover within seconds. The monitors responded to this fluctuation with synchronized updates, their displays briefly pausing before resuming with altered data sequences that suggested recalibration. Ethan's expression remained controlled, but his awareness sharpened further as he realized that the system was not only active but adaptive, responding dynamically to changes in presence and environmental feedback. The German Shepherd suddenly shifted its attention toward a narrow corridor leading out of the control room, its ears angled forward as if detecting a secondary signal beyond the visible systems. Ethan followed its line of focus and noticed that the corridor beyond was faintly illuminated by intermittent light sources embedded along the ceiling, each one pulsing at irregular intervals that matched no standard electrical rhythm. He moved toward the corridor cautiously, keeping one hand near his flashlight while maintaining visual awareness of both the dog and the surrounding equipment. As he stepped into the threshold, the temperature dropped slightly, and the ambient hum shifted in tone, becoming more layered, as though additional machinery had activated in response to their movement. The German Shepherd walked ahead, guiding him deeper into the passage without hesitation, stopping briefly at intersections where faint markings were visible on the walls, each one consisting of coded symbols that repeated throughout the structure. Ethan observed these markings closely, recognizing that they were not decorative or accidental, but functional indicators likely used for navigation within the hidden system. The corridor eventually opened into a secondary observation chamber, smaller than the main control room but equally active, filled with vertical display panels showing segmented building layouts and live positional indicators. Ethan stepped inside and immediately noticed that several markers on the display were moving independently of their location, suggesting dynamic tracking of entities within the facility. The German Shepherd positioned itself near the center of the room, its gaze locked on a specific section of the display where a cluster of signals converged in real time. Ethan approached slowly, analyzing the convergence point, and realized that the system was not simply monitoring the structure, but organizing movement patterns within it, as if coordinating or observing activity across multiple levels simultaneously. A soft confirmation tone echoed through the chamber, subtle but distinct, and the displays shifted again, highlighting a deeper layer of the hospital layout that had not been visible before. Ethan felt a tightening sense of realization as he understood that the facility contained multiple operational layers, each one functioning independently, yet interconnected through a centralized system that remained fully active despite the building's official abandonment. The German Shepherd remained still, maintaining focus on the same convergence point, as if confirming that they were approaching the core of the system's attention. The ambient hum intensified slightly, not in volume but in structure, becoming more rhythmic and precise, indicating increased computational activity responding to their exact position. Ethan exhaled slowly, scanning the room one final time, aware that every movement they made was now being recorded, analyzed, and integrated into the system's ongoing mapping process. The realization settled fully as he understood that they were no longer simply inside an abandoned hospital, but within a functioning network that had just transitioned from observation to full engagement. The moment Ethan Walker recognized that the facility was operating as a fully active layered network, the entire environment around him seemed to shift from passive observation to structured awareness, as if the system itself had moved one step closer to direct engagement. The German Shepherd stood in the center of the secondary chamber, unmoving, its gaze fixed on a concentrated cluster of signals displayed across multiple vertical screens that now pulsed in synchronized intervals. Ethan slowly approached, his flashlight lowered slightly as the ambient glow from the monitors became strong enough to illuminate the room without assistance, casting soft reflections across metallic surfaces and cables that ran in deliberate, organized paths along the floor. The data streams on the screens shifted again, this time stabilizing into a unified pattern that resembled a real-time map of the entire hospital complex, extending far beyond the visible structure into deeper, unmarked sections. Ethan studied the layout carefully, noticing that certain corridors and rooms were highlighted with subtle markers that changed intensity depending on movement within the building, suggesting continuous tracking of multiple active points. The German Shepherd suddenly took a single step forward, positioning itself directly beneath one of the central displays where the highest concentration of signals intersected, as if confirming that this was the focal point of the system's attention. Ethan's eyes followed the convergence, and he realized that the signals were not random, but organized around a central axis deep within the lower levels of the hospital, far beneath their current position. A faint tonal shift echoed through the chamber, different from the earlier mechanical hum, now resembling a structured notification tone that repeated at consistent intervals across multiple systems. Ethan felt a subtle tightening in his awareness as he recognized that this was not simply passive surveillance, but a coordinated response mechanism acknowledging their progression deeper into the facility. The German Shepherd remained focused, its body aligned with the direction of the deepest signal cluster, as if guiding Ethan not just through space, but through layers of operational intent embedded within the structure. Ethan adjusted his stance and moved closer to the main display, observing how the system had begun to refine its tracking resolution, narrowing down to specific zones with increasing precision. He noticed that the markers on the map were no longer static representations, but dynamic indicators that adjusted in real time to movement patterns detected within the hospital. The realization settled in more clearly now that every step they had taken since entering the building had been registered and integrated into this system's evolving model. Ethan turned slightly, scanning the surrounding equipment racks, and observed that auxiliary terminals were also updating simultaneously, indicating that this was not a localized system, but a fully networked infrastructure spanning multiple hidden sectors of the building. The German Shepherd suddenly shifted its attention toward a narrow maintenance door at the far end of the chamber, a door that had previously blended into the wall, but now appeared subtly illuminated by a faint edge light, that activated as they approached. Ethan followed the dog's gaze and moved closer, noticing that the door's surface contained no standard labeling, only a small embedded sensor panel that flickered softly as if awaiting authorization or proximity recognition. The ambient hum in the room deepened again, now layered with subtle rhythmic pulses that traveled through the floor and walls, creating the sensation that the entire structure was responding to their presence in coordinated waves. Ethan paused near the door, studying it carefully, and realized that this was not an entry point meant for general access, but a controlled threshold leading into a deeper operational layer of the system. The German Shepherd stood directly beside him, perfectly still, its posture aligned with the door, as if confirming that whatever lay beyond was the core source of the signals they had been tracking. Ethan raised his flashlight slightly, though the illumination was no longer necessary as the door's perimeter lights intensified, outlining its frame with precise clarity. A soft mechanical tone emitted from the sensor panel, followed by a brief pause, as if the system was evaluating their presence against internal parameters. Ethan remained motionless, aware that any movement might trigger further system response, while the German Shepherd maintained unwavering focus, its presence steady and intentional. The silence in the chamber deepened, and for a brief moment, even the background hum seemed to suspend itself, creating a sense of absolute stillness before the next transition. Then, with a quiet but deliberate release of mechanical locks, the door's indicator light shifted color, signaling that access had been granted at a level neither Ethan nor the system itself had fully anticipated. The moment the maintenance door unlocked with a quiet mechanical confirmation, Ethan Walker felt the entire system around him shift into a new operational state, as if the facility had moved from observation into controlled acknowledgement of their presence. The German Shepherd stood directly beside him, its body perfectly aligned with the threshold, eyes fixed on the narrow seam of the door as it slowly began to separate from the frame without any physical force applied. A soft hydraulic release echoed through the chamber, followed by a steady expansion of light spilling outward from within, not harsh or clinical, but structured and deliberate, as if designed to reveal only what was permitted to be seen. Ethan stepped forward cautiously, crossing the threshold into a narrow transition space that immediately felt different from every section they had passed through so far. The air here was cleaner, filtered, and carried a faint mechanical undertone that suggested active environmental control systems still functioning below ground level. The German Shepherd moved ahead without hesitation, guiding him through a short passage that opened into a large subterranean chamber far beyond the original hospital blueprint. Ethan paused at the entrance, taking in the scale of what lay before him, a vast circular operations space lined with layered observation decks, suspended data displays, and synchronized monitoring stations arranged in concentric formations around a central platform. The lighting in the chamber was uniform and stable, unlike the flickering systems above, indicating a fully maintained infrastructure operating independently from the abandoned hospital structure above. Ethan slowly stepped inside, his boots making minimal sound against the polished surface, while his eyes tracked the continuous flow of information moving across multiple transparent display panels that floated in vertical alignment throughout the space. The German Shepherd moved toward the central platform and stopped, positioning itself directly beneath a suspended interface where a large circular projection displayed a detailed three-dimensional map of the entire hospital complex, extending far beyond the known structure into deeper subterranean layers. Ethan approached carefully, noticing that the map was not static but continuously evolving, with multiple active nodes highlighting movement patterns, system responses, and structural access points that shifted in real time. A soft tonal sequence echoed through the chamber, different from previous alerts, more refined and deliberate, as if confirming a successful transition into a higher operational tier. Ethan observed that several data streams converged toward a single central coordinate deep beneath the facility, marked by layered identifiers that pulsed at steady intervals, suggesting a primary control or observation core. The German Shepherd remained completely still, its gaze locked onto the same central convergence point, reinforcing the direction without movement or sound. Ethan studied the surrounding systems more closely, realizing that this chamber was not merely a monitoring station, but a command-level interface designed to integrate all lower and upper facility operations into a unified network. He noticed that the data feeds included environmental readings, structural integrity reports, and continuous behavioral tracking indicators that updated with precision timing, suggesting full automation supported by real-time analytical processing. The realization formed gradually that the entire abandoned hospital narrative above was only a surface layer, masking a deeply integrated operational environment still functioning beneath official records. Ethan shifted his attention back to the central projection, where the primary coordinate began to pulse more intensely, indicating increased activity or recognition of their proximity. The German Shepherd stepped forward slightly, placing itself closer to the central interface, and for the first time since entering the facility, its posture reflected not just guidance but confirmation, as if acknowledging that they had reached the intended destination of their path. Ethan felt a subtle vibration pass through the floor beneath them, synchronized with a soft recalibration tone that echoed across the chamber, causing several surrounding displays to update simultaneously. The lighting adjusted slightly, narrowing focus toward the central platform, and Ethan realized that the system was not simply reacting to their presence anymore, but actively aligning itself around them as registered participants within its operational structure. He stood still for a moment, absorbing the full scale of what he was witnessing, as the chamber stabilized into a controlled equilibrium where every signal, every display, and every pulse of data converged on a single unresolved center deep within the network. The moment Ethan Walker stood in the center of the subterranean command chamber, watching the entire system stabilize around a single unresolved core, the environment shifted once again into a deeper state of alignment, as if the facility had reached the final layer of its operational structure and was now preparing to reveal its full intent. The German Shepherd remained directly beneath the central projection, perfectly still, its eyes locked onto the pulsing coordinate that now dominated every display in the room. Ethan slowly raised his gaze, observing as the three-dimensional map above them expanded in precision, zooming inward toward a point far below the visible hospital structure, revealing a sealed sublevel that had not appeared in any prior architectural data he had reviewed. The chamber responded with a soft, resonant tone, followed by a synchronized recalibration across all surrounding systems. And Ethan realized that the network was no longer simply tracking movement, but actively synchronizing environmental states with their exact position. He stepped slightly forward, careful and deliberate, noticing that the floor beneath the central platform contained faint embedded lines of circuitry that pulsed in rhythm with the data streams above, suggesting direct physical integration between structure and system. The German Shepherd turned its head briefly toward Ethan, then back to the projection, maintaining focus on the central convergence point, as if confirming that they had arrived at the intended origin of every signal they had been following since entering the hospital. Ethan studied the projection more closely, and for the first time, the data revealed a clear structural separation between the abandoned hospital and the active subterranean network beneath it, showing multiple operational layers stacked vertically like a concealed hierarchy of systems. A soft shift in lighting occurred across the chamber, narrowing focus onto the central coordinate, and Ethan noticed that the system was not only mapping space, but also projecting temporal markers, indicating activity patterns that extended beyond static monitoring into continuous historical tracking. The realization formed fully now that this facility had been functioning independently for an extended period, maintaining operational continuity without external acknowledgement or official oversight. The German Shepherd stepped forward onto the edge of the central platform, and at that exact moment, the projection responded, expanding outward in a ripple-like motion that revealed a final locked layer beneath the deepest coordinate. Ethan felt a subtle vibration pass through the structure, stronger than before, and the ambient tone shifted into a sustained harmonic frequency that filled the entire chamber without increasing in volume, as if the system itself had entered a stable final state of recognition. He moved closer to the projection, eyes tracing the newly revealed layer, which displayed a sealed core environment marked with continuous monitoring indicators and restricted access boundaries that pulsed in synchronized intervals. The German Shepherd remained focused, its posture steady, as if acknowledging that this layer represented the true origin of everything they had experienced so far. Ethan observed that multiple data streams converged into this central core, including environmental control logs, movement tracking sequences, and system integrity reports that all fed into a unified processing node hidden deep beneath the facility. The chamber lighting adjusted again, this time forming a subtle circular gradient around the central platform, reinforcing the sense that all systems were now fully aligned around their presence. Ethan took a slow breath, scanning every available display, and realized that the system had transitioned beyond observation and tracking into full situational integration, where their presence had become part of the operational model itself. The German Shepherd took one final step forward, positioning itself directly under the brightest point of the projection, and the entire chamber responded with a synchronized pulse that traveled through every display, every interface, and every embedded structure within the room. Ethan stood still beside it, fully aware that they were no longer entering a hidden system, but standing at the precise center of one that had been waiting for activation through their arrival, completing the final connection between the surface world above and the concealed network that had been operating beneath it all along.